Hey guys! So, in this video we are going to talk a little bit about taking your time, or how fast you code and what that means about you. So let's get into it. Now, there was a great question the other day about Mark Zuckerberg. Or rather, I read a great question about Mark Zuckerberg on Quora Digest, I think, where the question was basically, how can someone like Mark Zuckerberg be so successful and extraordinary, and yet it takes 2 hours to write some code that most people would write in 5 minutes? Now, the answer to this question was posted by another programmer that explained basically that I think that we can all agree that as an entrepreneur, Mr. Zuckerberg is fairly successful. But here's the true puzzle. You see, this programmer has been programming for years and years and years, and he poses a question basically to the original author and saying, well, there's plenty of stuff that I take 2 hours to do that you can probably do in 5 minutes. Does that make, who is the better programmer? Does that make you a better programmer than me? And that's a great question. The time it takes you to finish a task, does that indicate skill? Now, this is hands down the hardest question to answer when it comes to measuring programming skill. It is actually to the point where it is so difficult to measure how good a software developer is that honestly, I don't think it can be done. To an extent it can be done. In very controlled, simple situations, it can be done. But let me just walk you through why this is so hard. Now, let's for the sake of argument say that you have a non-trivial application. Let's for the sake of argument say that you're working in a really, really big code base. And then you have 2 programmers. So the first programmer is the sort of person who usually gets things done very quickly and for the most part ships things fairly frequently. The other programmer is very slow, methodical, has a very slow and analytical process of writing software. Now, who is going to be more valuable to the company? Well, it is reasonable to say that the person who is very quick, gets things done fast, and ships them very frequently is the sort of person who is going to produce the most amount of money. But is that true, necessarily? Think about it. Speed, unless coupled with an understanding and consideration for the impact that what you are building, may be very dangerous. If you are building something from absolute scratch very quickly, that's fairly low risk if you can get it right. But if you're building something very quickly and it doesn't work, then it doesn't have as much value. If you consider on top of that if you are very quick when you write your software and you produce a lot of bugs as a result, your solution was shipped, but it causes regressions or other types of issues in this big system, then is that all that valuable? Because if you factor in the time that it will take for the company to solve the bugs and the money it will, in theory, it could cost to have those bugs, well, that's time too. That's money too. And if you then consider that having somebody who's very quick, very fast, produces software very quick, and so forth, in a really rapid pace, if that person has the speed, in theory, the odds of that person breaking something is actually higher, because in theory they don't have as much time, or maybe they're just very, very smart, but the odds are that they are simply not considering the full scope or the full spectrum of what they're doing. In other words, it's very likely, I would argue, that they will produce more bugs or more issues because they're quote-unquote hacking things together and making things happen very quickly. Now let's reverse it and say, all right, is it better to be a slow programmer? Well, if you are the sort of very analytical person and you consider all the things and you're very slow, you're very methodical, then yes, your software may have a fairly decent quality to it. That's not necessarily true. I mean, you can just be a very slow thinker and still produce average results. Question is that a bad thing? Well, the odds of you getting a full understanding, a full spectrum of all the possible things that can break or can go wrong, or all the different corner cases, and considering all the things. I mean, doing that, if you're a slow thinker or a very slow programmer, it's likely that you will catch more things. It's the same thing that you kind of see with test-driven development versus not test-driven development. It's very often that you see the slow, methodical software developers who work in really big systems have the sort of mindset that a test-driven development style of working fits very well into. However, prototype type of people who are like more fast and iterative, they don't really like test-driven development all that much. That's just me kind of feeling just a gut feeling for me, at least from what I can see. So being slow and methodical in a really large system could be a very good thing, depending on how complex the system is, depending on the feature that you are shipping. And that's the key point here. The feature you're shipping has a lot to do with it as well. Because a slow methodical thinker can be very useful if you are changing something that is very complex, where the odds of getting it wrong is very high. It's high risk. And it's great to be a slow thinker. But it's really shitty to have a slow thinker if you are prototyping something from scratch and that person tries to write perfect, flawless software and consider all the corner cases and make an engineering masterpiece, that it doesn't really fit the situation. And then you have considerations such as, all right, what type of problem are you solving? Because every problem is different. Everything that makes it makes it even harder to determine whether or not somebody is good or bad. I mean, the closest thing to being good or bad I can imagine is measuring it by some trivial little, say, FizzBuzz. Who can solve the FizzBuzz algorithm the quickest? Is that the most important thing? As I said, it depends. Being fast is sometimes very good, and being slow is sometimes very good. It depends on the context. And that is why I argue it's almost impossible to measure how good a software developer is. It's very tricky. Because as I said, there are too many variables, there is too many things that you have to think about and consider in order to make that call, basically. So if we go back to Zuckerberg, this is what I've told some of you before. The best engineers in the world are not the richest. Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and all these people, they are not the best software developers in the world. They simply are good businessmen and decent software developers. So what I want to come back to here is that I want to touch on something that a teacher of mine said to me a long time ago. And he said that if I produce 30 lines of code in an hour, that's a good job. Now, at the time I felt that's kind of weird, that seems very slow. But if you consider, as I said, if you consider that depending on what type of software you're writing, what type of project you are working on, that could be a very, very good amount of code. And it could also be very shitty. It kind of depends. And that's why I think that, personally, I think that you shouldn't focus so much on how fast you produce the code. You should find a pace of producing software, and this is the important part, so please pay attention now. The goal is not to be fast or slow. The goal is to have it working. It has to work. Because as I said, the common factor here is that if you need to be slow in order to write correct software, you have to be slow. If you are writing software that needs to be shipped very quickly, it still has to work. Doesn't matter if you're fast or slow. Depending on the situation, you may have to write ugly code or very well-maintainable, well-documented code. But at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is that it works. Have a great day.